Okay, so this is an episode, our first episode on Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, Chapter 1. And I'm Craig Shoemake, and
I'm Chad Schmidt.
yeah, so just to follow up on what
We
you
are
were
the
just,
cult of conversation.
yeah, I'm sorry, you're much better at remembering that than I am.
Yeah.
I just launch in. Here from the halls of knowledge.
And my tent in the forest.
Clearly, I have more knowledge than you do.
Yeah, you do. You're way ahead of me, buddy, for sure.
There's got to be something. Maybe there are some stormtroopers back there. I
That's
don't
what
know.
it looks like to me.
I have not looked behind the various doors.
Yeah.
Anyway, so so Chad, you were just saying about this idea of like just kind of laying out a sentence or so, like from the text, as to what this is about. So I think this is what I kind of take it. He started off the chapter with Kant's definition of the Enlightenment, and it's not a full quote, but essentially he's quoting Kant, and Kant is saying that the Enlightenment was, quote, humankind's emergence from its self-incurred immaturity. And then this is not fully a quote, but basically the rejection of, quote, dogmas and formulas. So I'm
right.
So he's basically, the rest of this chapter, as I understand it, is expounding upon what Kant said there in brief.
Yeah. So I'll just take a swing at what you just said.
Yeah.
The chapter title is Dare to Understand, right? So one of the main things is that he's implying that knowledge requires courage and that it's cowardly to accept faith and dogmas and formulas.
And that was Kant's motto for the Enlightenment. That's actually my next note. That's where the chapter title came from.
Yeah.
It's directly
So
from Kant.
I think that's right. I mean, I think you nailed it. There's only one other thing that one sentence that to me, I actually would have picked instead of that. Mm-hmm. Maybe because I've read Kant's What is Enlightenment so many times. I used to teach it when I was still in the university. But the one that I picked was on page 10. If you take a look, the very top sentence of his own, not that.
Hold up, let me get it. I've got my notes here. The book is not open yet.
Yeah, so page 10,
okay.
Right at the top of the page, you see the quote. I'm talking the first sentence underneath the quote is, to me, it's functionally that entire last part of the paragraph. To the Enlightenment thinkers, the escape from ignorance and superstition showed how mistaken our conventional wisdom could be, and how the methods of science, by which he means skepticism, fallibilism, open debate, and empirical testing, are a paradigm of how to achieve reliable knowledge. So to me, this entire chapter, and this to me seems like a setup for what I think is coming later in the book, which is the value of reliable knowledge and the methods by which you can achieve reliable knowledge, why they're reliable.
Yeah, and he lays that out, that those are the methods of science specifically. So
that's right. And I mean, when he means science, I don't think he's fairly narrow-minded in what that means. I think he means any method that produces reliable knowledge, whatever it is, right?
Yeah. Obviously, so that's an excellent point. So I think we can talk about science here in the broadest sense of a systematic way of gathering information and coming to some reasoned conclusion about that information.
That's right. Yeah.
I don't think so. Here's the interesting thing. So even though I would, obviously the Enlightenment in Western Europe, so Leanna just chimed in. She wants,
that was her.
yeah. So oh no, this is regarding our hike. So okay. She'll get back. She's now texting, so I'll hear from her shortly.
For our viewers, we're talking about somebody we want to interview.
We want to interview someone who knows Steven Pinker's ex-wife. We can get the goods on Steven Pinker. And actually, what's funny is she did mention that when Leanna talked about, talked about this book or the Better Angels of Our Nature with that lady. I don't know her name, but the lady said, "Oh yeah, and you should read all of the counter arguments that came out against that book,
Yeah,
all the stuff
okay.
direct from the ex-wife." So,
Okay,
yeah,
interesting.
that could be. Maybe we could have the ex-wife on here one
Yeah, that's a good
day.
idea. I think we should get his
We've got a
ex-wife on here.
contact.
So,
Yeah.
so
So, well, oh, you just froze.
he
I'm just
kind of
going to talk.
picked. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, if you're freezing, I'm just going to keep on talking. So,
Yeah.
in the absence of you saying something, I'm going to say something. So yeah, no, I think we do need to use science in the broadest sense. So I kind of defined it right there, and I don't think, obviously, that Western Europe was the first to have any kind of a paradigm that you could call scientific. I do think it was the first civilization that really ran with it and kind of took it to its logical conclusion. So there have been arguments. So, for example, there was a scholar, I think, was he either American or British, Joseph Needham, who wrote a 6-volume work on science and civilization in ancient China. So clearly, some people have believed that other civilizations had, to a certain extent, scientific outlooks or um,
Models.
yeah, yeah. But clearly they didn't. It didn't survive. So that's a case in point where you could look at some of the political upheavals in China. Maybe these upheavals, not just political but societal, essentially derailed or dismantled and destroyed the the structures that were enabling some kind of scientific endeavor. And you have to wonder, is that potentially a period that we're kind of entering here? But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the what you're getting at is what are the things in history that have interrupted the process of undermining faith and dogma as trustworthy vehicles of coming to conclusions about truth and morality,
Yeah.
right? I mean, to me, those are the obstacles because they are so seductive and comforting, but untrustworthy and unreliable, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it takes courage, because it's easy to just take up a formula or a dogma, or you can believe anything on faith.
Yeah.
It has no parameters. Faith sleeps with anybody, right? So is a promiscuous lover. So I think he's trying to say that there are the limits that were created by science and skepticism, the methodology, and a shift from I think ontology to epistemology is a kind of a fancy way of describing what he's getting at here. A shift from who you are and who you're told you are and how you're told the world is true, to methods that you can use yourself independently of the church, state, or authority to come to true and reliable conclusions.
So since I do have a page and a half of notes here,
Yeah, go for it.
so the motto, "Dare to Understand." Where was he? Where was that? Okay, yeah. So and then he said that that was dependent upon freedom of thought and speech. And I don't know if you heard about it just recently. There was a teacher in France, in Paris, who was beheaded. Because you heard about that, yeah,
Yeah, I
because she
did.
showed pictures of Muhammad, and
A student apparently, I got to look back at it, but apparently what I recall is that she even took the Muslim students in the class out of the class.
well, she told them, yeah, that don't come in if
This
you
is
would be offended or something.
that's right.
Yeah, yeah,
And so I think the kid was maybe 18 years old, cut her.
yeah. The one who committed the
And I
crime.
think he
Yeah.
was killed, right? When
Oh, yeah, the police shot him. But yeah, and so I kind of reread this. The reason that came up for me was because I wrote these notes down. Was it yesterday, day before yesterday, and it was fresh in the news. And I was rereading the stuff that I had outlined or that I'd underlined and made notes on. And I'd underlined the fact, foundational demand is freedom of thought and speech. And I was like, oh my God, and that was just in the news. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
so.
Well, and everybody's too scared to defend the most important value we have as a community is.
Yeah, so you really got to wonder, like, when you've got a situation like that. I mean, I think anybody should be able to draw a picture of anybody they want to, and if the Muslims don't want to draw a picture of Muhammad, fine, but they can't
What was
impose that upon other people. It's the problem.
what was horrifying about this whole thing, not just this incident to me, is that none of the journalistic community rose up and said, "We're with you," and published what and just said, "Nope,
It was the
we're
same way with the Charlie Hebdo
everybody."
thing,
Everybody needs
Chad.
to, every teacher now,
Yeah.
needs to go into their classroom and do the same thing.
The exact same thing was said when Charlie Hebdo got hit, and most well, I don't know if any venues went ahead and actually, and it's ironic because, of course, the actual cartoons should have been a part of any story where you're talking about the cartoons. It would just make sense.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't reprint the cartoons.
I know, horrifying.
And so we have now, the whole Western civilization has to self-censor these little scribbles.
Yeah.
It's absolutely mind-boggling. But yeah, so that really just immediately came to mind as I was writing these notes down. And so you can see why one civilization is able to make progress in a material way and one is not. And if you think of everything that, I mean, if you go to the Middle East, you can find cars and computers and et cetera, et cetera. The only reason you find that stuff, though, is because they got it from a civilization that had not behaved that way.
That's right.
I mean, that's a pretty harsh way to put it. Unfortunately, I think it's pretty obviously true.
Well, it's really, to me, the world should be, but isn't, in a contest about methodology. Instead, it's in a contest about content.
Yeah.
And whose content is correct. And so it puts the wrong foot forward every time.
Right.
First, let's figure out what the method is that you're using to come to conclusions and whether it's worthy of trust beyond the scope of your own particular ideology. Or can it be your methodology be used by Mormons to come to conclusion that they're right? Can your methodology provide your ability to say you're right and somebody else who has a contradictory opinion is right at the same time? And it's a pretty simple method of coming to a conclusion about who has at least methodological reliability.
You see, though, why that's such a hard leap, though, because the moment you remove the emphasis from the content, you have to admit that the content might be incorrect or incomplete.
You rise above you're basically putting yourself above the content.
Exactly. So,
and I think that's the threat to people who they don't want to see God be, what right do you have to determine the method of coming to truth? You're not God, which is ridiculous. It's hilarious. But
well, imagine all the powers that be that have something at stake in the content.
Without having to address methodology.
Right. Yeah. And that's like the guys who refused to look through the telescope when Galileo said, "Here,
that's
check
right."
it out."
That stood out to me was skepticism, because it gets a lot of there's a lot of misunderstanding around skepticism. He's not talking about just being skeptical. It's actually a technical methodology.
You're referring to
page 10.
Page 10. Okay.
Yeah, right. Page 10. In that quote, he lists, when he talks about methods of science, and he names those. What skepticism is a methodological. He's never talking about like just being not believing stuff. Skepticism teaches you helps you separate out what is worth believing from what is not. It doesn't teach you not to believe things. And so it's not an ideology, it's a methodology.
Yeah. Do you want to, so that's on page 10. And before that, what he starts doing though, is he goes into the 4 themes of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, that's
really the meat and potatoes of the whole chapter.
Yeah, I agree.
So
he adds a kind of secondary, second place 5th item at the end of the chapter. Did you notice that, where he throws in peace at the end?
He throws in what?
Peace. So he goes, he lists the four, but right at the end on page 13, he goes, this brings us to another Enlightenment idea
Oh, I think
piece.
I see what you're talking about. Intelligent
So yeah,
governance.
so he does list the four big ones, but then he has these other subcategories. So let's name the big four. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So the four themes of the Enlightenment. Yeah. Reason, science, humanism, and progress.
Reason, science, humanism, and progress.
Progress. Yeah.
Right.
And I just want to see, was there something else just before that? Okay, that's not really, yeah, that's really the important stuff. So we can kind of start riffing on these one by one.
Now, why don't you read a couple of sections of the reason one if that stood out to you?
I actually had a little bit of an issue with this first paragraph.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not critical of what it says, more for what it does not say.
Okay. Yeah.
But do you want to read it, or?
Yeah, I'll read the first
Okay.
paragraph then.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Foremost is reason, and he says reason is non-negotiable. So it's the principle. So there's a bit of a hierarchy here, right, Craig? Don't
Yeah.
say he's setting up between the four different elements of enlightenment. Reason is the pinnacle. As soon as you show up to discuss the question of what we should live for, or any other question, as long as you insist that your answers, whatever they are reasonable or justified or true, and that therefore other people ought to believe them too, then you have committed yourself to reason and to holding your beliefs accountable to objective standards. Let me just stop there for a quick second. Our title of this podcast is Cult of Conversation, and he's essentially saying that reason is non-negotiable because you can't speak and have a conversation that's meaningful unless it's reasonable, right? And so he's saying it's
otherwise we're just jabbering into the wind.
it's inevitable, or there's just sounds happening, which does happen sometimes.
Or the swords are coming out.
Or the swords are coming out.
That's the other option.
Right.
We can speak gibberish, we can be rational, or we can chop each other's heads
off.
Well,
that's why I always try to suggest that there are only three ways we solve problems. I mean, I think what's his name? Sam Harris says there are two, but I think there are three. There's contemplation, conversation, and coercion. And I think you're right. I prefer the middle one. The middle one is the most useful.
Yeah.
And even in Kant's What is Enlightenment, he challenges contemplation as limited in scope because it's an enlightenment of one. And he says that
well, it's not it doesn't have any social effects.
Yeah, he says there's no such thing as an enlightenment of one. That's irrelevant to the world. And so conversation is the pinnacle. And the downward slope, the bottom in the valley is coercion.
Right. Yeah. Which is what people usually go to most of the
yeah, right. Which is what I think much of the world is really tempted to do right now because everybody's so riled up.
Well, unfortunately, that's the story of history. I think real conversation between large numbers of people has been in the minority most of the time because, I mean, all forms of authoritarian government is based upon coercion.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
So
the last part.
You want to read the rest of that paragraph?
Yeah, just the last part of that initial portion, and where he says, and to holding your beliefs accountable to objective standards. I don't care whether he says objective or not. I think objective is crucial, but it's the accountability. So in other words, it's shifting trust from your own intuitions, your heart's intuitions.
My gut always tells me.
God or whatever somebody tells you, anything that doesn't have a standard in objectivity is by definition unreasonable. Right? Your intuition, you can't use your intuitions to affirm that your intuitions are right. They can't be evidence of themselves, of the truths they, Krishna is the true God to worship and has will provide you with the highest level of God consciousness. That's a claim that I've heard Hare Krishnas make before, right? And so what is the standard? What are they accountable to? And
Krishna.
And that's exactly it. But they'll say they're accountable to their own hearts. I just heard a guy say this online. They're accountable to their own heart's intuitions. And then somebody asked, well, but if everybody trusts their heart's intuitions, how do you determine that Muslims are wrong
Genghis
about
Khan
Quran?
was also accountable to his own heart.
Right. And so then he said, well, other people have cognitive dissonance. I'm like, well, that's circular. So you judge what other people's cognitive dissonance by your own heart. And then your own heart is the measure of what constitutes cognitive dissonance. It's completely circular. And that kind of reasoning is why you have to locate trust in a source of knowledge that is a standard, and objectivity.
What you're arguing for there, I think, is publicly available evidence.
Testable.
It can't be, the dream I had last night revealed the secrets of, your future or whatever.
So it also scientific consensus is also very different than, say, religious consensus, because in religious consensus, everybody says, yeah, Krishna consciousness is the right thing. I experienced it, right? So, and we all did. So therefore, that we have a pile of people as evidence. A pile of private experiences does not constitute greater evidence than a single moment of
that's interesting.
evidence.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
So it's a different form of consensus than in science, because it's religious experience is testable only in your private life. You can't confirm it outside of yourself and test it. But it's a complicated difference. It's relatively subtle and seductive to suggest that the spiritual community and the scientific community have that similarity in common.
So
I'll read the rest of this.
Okay, yeah.
If there's anything the Enlightenment thinkers had in common, it was an insistence that we energetically apply the standard of reason to understanding our world, and not fall back on generators of delusion like faith, dogma, revelation, authority, charisma, mysticism, divination, visions, gut feelings, or the hermeneutic parsing of sacred texts.
That's a pretty in-your-face statement.
Yeah, but the list, maybe we should go through that list and talk about, and actually look at what each of those are, because
I actually do want to, as I said earlier, there was an aspect here of his discussion on reason, because he then goes into the next point, science, at the top of the next page.
Sure. Yeah.
He never at any point here really tried to define what he meant by reason.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
and so earlier chapter.
Well, so my question, actually, I wrote here on the side, I wrote reason equals logic, question mark. I mean, is that, because you can justify all sorts of crazy things on the basis of just logic. So, what it would have been nice if he had tried to give some kind of definition.
That's a really good point. I don't think he does. The laws of logic, identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle. I mean,
this just from the stand. I'm sorry, you're kind of overlapping.
Please go ahead.
Just from the standpoint of narrative, I can see maybe why he didn't do that, because in order to do that, it is going to require a bit of technical getting into the weeds, and so that could sort of derail him from his point here, which is to lay out the sort of four pillars of the Enlightenment. And so, like I say, from a narrative standpoint, I can kind of understand why he didn't do that, but that was the first thing that I started scratching my head over as I was reading. I was like, okay, well, how are you defining reason? I mean, one person, and are there different types of reason?
Is reasonable is something that is reasonable something different too, right? It is.
If something seems reasonable to you, does that mean that you reasoned it out?
Right. Yeah, is reason something that inevitably leads you to true conclusions, or is it a method by which you justify a belief on other standards after the fact, right? And so can it be used post hoc? Of course. So it's a pretty
clearly, actually, your familiarity with apologetics, if that's not an exercise in post hoc reasoning, what is?
That's why science is so fascinating, because its obsession with novel, testable predictions. You can always come up, there's an infinite number of answers for why I dropped my cup. or my cup fell off the table. It could be fairies, it could be wind, it could be I bumped it. There are an infinite number of possible reasons after the fact that could be used to justify why the thing fell off the. But if you want to test, well, let me use it this way: like if if you want to say a squirrel did it, you could test for that. Is there squirrel droppings around the cup, right?
Or did anyone see a squirrel?
Right, and but you'd have to say it'd have to predict something, right? I mean, to me, that's the key. It can't be post hoc in science. That's how science actually gets rid of the threat of post hoc reasoning, is by saying that the test has to be a novel, testable prediction. It has to be something you can demonstrate has predictive power to be trustworthy. Otherwise, it can't be, because it's always going to be in the present. You can justify anything. Christians and Muslims can come to the same conclusion that they're right on anything that happens after it's happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. Anything else on that?
No, just the idea of the list. I found the list interesting. Faith, dogma, revelation. I don't
you wanted to go through those?
Well, I just want to make sure we understand each of those and their value historically. Faith, to me, is the permission we basically give ourselves to believe things when evidence and reasons runs out. So, because you don't ever go, well, why do you believe this? Because of faith. You give the reasons, right? Because you know that faith can't be a warranted reason. And so I think it's the permission people generally give themselves to believe things when reasons and evidence run out.
Yeah, I don't know how Pinker is specifically. I think that
Are you able to turn that off? Yeah, that dinger off.
She says, "Sure, I'm always happy to talk about Mormonism anytime. I'm flattered."
Okay, all right, cool.
So I will
turn that dinger off on your phone, because I can hear it pretty loud.
Okay,
listening's going to be able to
these
hear
things
it.
are plugged in my ears. So anyway, yeah. So I don't know how he's really using that, but I know one thing that always bothers me. This word faith now has become a sort of pablum that religious people love to bring up to justify, why they think X, Y, and Z. And I have no problem with them using the word, but what I would prefer is every time someone wants to be on the TV or they're getting interviewed and they want to talk about their faith, for them to be really honest, what they really should do is simply substitute the word faith for ideology.
Interesting.
I think, imagine all the times you've heard people talk wax poetic about how their faith comforts them, or, well, my faith doesn't tell me that. What if they, in that exact conversation, that exact sentence, they were to substitute that word
I see.
with ideology, the word ideology.
I was defining faith as and methodologically, you're talking about as a name for the content of belief.
Because I
can
hear,
stand in for that. My faith, it's a benign way to say I'm a Christian.
Oh yeah, I just watch any politician or any supporter of some cause, and they will inevitably, if it's about religion, they will come back, and that word faith will come up many times, and it's a word now that is culturally or socially untouchable. You can't attack someone.
Yeah.
So, for example,
Protected.
the whole Supreme Court nomination process that we're now going through. So this lady, I have heard many senators talk about her in defense of her because of her faith. She's a woman of faith. She talks about her faith. Her faith helps her choose. Yeah. And every time I hear that, I'm like, okay, if you want to talk that way, let's just get really honest. Replace that word faith with the word ideology, and we'll all know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's not warm and fuzzy. It's a cold, hard, mean thing filled with all sorts of nonsense.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I'd even prefer something more specific. Well, which faith are you talking about specifically? Name it, because as soon as you name like Christianity or Mormonism, people have their assessments. You don't want that. You want everybody to just hear faith, and it's soft and it's
it's a very warm and squishy, fuzzy word. Yeah, and I've just gotten so tired of that, and it's this sugary word. So, like I said, I don't know what he was really But whenever I see this, so faith and dogma to me, I don't see any real distinction there between these two.
Oh, that's
I think,
interesting. Yeah. So, so what you're talking about though is faith that is a substitute name for an ideology. That
yeah,
and it
exactly.
is used that way. The way that
99% of the time when I hear people using the word faith, they're referencing back to their ideological stand-in, whatever it may be, and that is what gives them leeway or the excuse to do XYZ or say XYZ or whatever.
well,
And so dogma is just the hardcore.
So to justify the definition that I gave, I would say, yeah, I have no problem actually.
No, what is your definition on that, Chad? How
My
are you
definition is the permission people give themselves to believe something.
So you're thinking in terms of like a methodological kind of.
Yeah, so the permission people give themselves when their reasons and evidence run out.
Okay. Oh no, I'm totally fine with that. It's just that I have a knee-jerk response to that word. I've become so.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're responding to is the shelter it provides people just by the sound of it.
And it's used in
protection. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's especially used publicly. You see, whenever people get up on a soapbox, you see this in interviews. You hear it on the radio. Politicians love talking about their faith because it immediately insulates them from criticism. You cannot.
So here's why I think my definition is helpful here. Because what is it specifically that they don't have to do when they use that word? They don't have to provide reasons or evidence anymore.
Right. They don't have to defend themselves.
That's how it gives them permission not to have to bother with reasons or evidence. So it is a replacement of a substitute for reasons and evidence.
Oh yeah, no, I'm totally on.
So I actually think that the methodologically, it works exactly like it does politically. That's how the shelter comes in, right? Is because if it's protected. It's also the right, interestingly, is using political correctness more often in that case than others to protect itself, because it's not politically correct to challenge somebody's faith. They get to avoid having. Why do you believe abortion is murder? Well, because the Bible says it is, and God wrote the Bible or has inspired the Bible. But they don't say that. They say, well, my faith, right? And then they don't have to explain their reasons or evidence because they don't have any. Yeah. It's basically a way to believe something without having to have reasons or evidence be the basis for that.
Oh yeah, no, I'm totally on board with that.
Yeah, so dogma.
I have an allergy to the word though.
The difference I would say with dogma from what you're talking about. So what you're talking about with faith is just naming the content without having to explain the content. So
exactly.
To me, dogma more precisely is an idea that without which you cannot name yourself within that ideology. So it's something that you have to believe is locked in. It's not open to conversation. So a dogma is an idea that if you want to name yourself X, a Christian, you have to believe this, or you don't get to name yourself a Christian. It's what's non-negotiable, what's not up for conversation.
Sure.
So that's why it's an enemy, is because it's those ideas that we're not allowed to talk about. And those ideas are sheltered by faith, right?
So in both cases here, what we have, faith, dogma, which seem to be, it sounds like different sides of the coin. These are conversation stoppers, essentially.
That's right. There you go. I think that's right. They're what he sees them as threatening is the only vehicle we have of coming to solutions without violence or isolation.
Right.
Conversation.
Which is why there is so much violence in the name of faith and dogma.
Well, and I think isolation is actually a big threat right now too, because people are so freaked out. It's tempting to
silo. This is social media. That's the whole issue.
Well, siloing is one thing. I don't mean that. That's an interesting thing we should talk about today with the internet and stuff. But I mean literally like, I have friends, especially in the US right now, who if I call them and they say, no, I can't, I don't talk to anybody about this stuff. I won't talk to my neighbor who's a Republican, or I won't talk to this Democrat. I can't handle them. I can't be with them. And so they're not, it's not just that they're siloing themselves within their own self-affirming media
Mhm.
loop. It's that they're basically unwilling to attempt at persuasion.
Hmm.
Persuasion is
I may
been
be guilty of this,
abandoned for
Chad.
persuasion has been left behind for self-expression, and
Yeah.
self-expression is just I'm this, fuck you, right?
No, no. Well, so
This
you're,
is just like, and that's useless. It does nothing to
yeah, no, no.
transform the world.
I haven't said that to anybody lately, but
I mean, just just by isolating yourself, it's an implied critique. It's an implied critique of their relevance because you're not
well,
willing
I'm
to
I'm
engage
thinking
them.
of certain people I know who I probably will never tell them about this channel, but and I won't mention, but I would be very hesitant to, well, in the times in the past when I have broached issues, I've been met by such a bafflement that is either they're completely um, just they are not informed, or they have gone down the rabbit hole of alternate media where Bill O'Reilly is source material for understanding history.
Well,
That
and I mean,
that kind of,
I
and
think
I
go ahead.
don't the conversation that ensues is not satisfying.
But if we're going to call ourselves the cult of conversation, what do you say to that? Like, and how do you engage somebody with this model in mind, right? With this methodological goal, if we appreciate what he's talking about historically, and I do. I mean, I'm not. I do value these ideals. How can they become a bigger part of the world if we're not asking questions of the people who we feel are uninterested in these ideas,
Well,
right? And then
so
engage
that's
in
an
real
interesting,
conversation.
that's a really interesting question. Of course, a lot of this has to do with family dynamics and, do you want to keep your friends or
Yeah,
certain
I'm not talking about necessarily
acquaintances?
people close to you. It is
That's
hard
what
to,
I'm talking about is,
yeah.
if you're going to, your Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner or whatever, and you really have to pick your battles and ask yourself, is it worth it to debate this excruciating point that has just come up in the news lately, whatever it may be? Because we can wax poetic all we want about, Steven Pinker, the Enlightenment, and the past 350 years of European and Western civilization, but not everybody wants to have this thrust in their face over Christmas dinner or over the phone.
No, I
And
don't want that. I don't want to be the person who does that anyways, but
yeah,
I do wish that there were ways to create opportunities with those we do care about to have serious conversations that are scary, that are uncomfortable, that are risky, and still manage to demonstrate care for other people who you disagree with, even if
yeah.
profoundly, right? I mean, this is the problem, right? I mean, it's if you take conversation seriously, it's something you have to not give up on. I mean, maybe at the moment you don't just keep going once you've hit a dead end. I don't mean that, but I mean being always open to talking to people who you disagree with. I wish people are too afraid of that in my world, too uncomfortable, and I wish it happened more. Actually,
It's actually easier,
I'm
I
not sure it's
think, in
fear, but
many
it's whatever it
respects.
is. What's that?
No, I'm saying it's easier to do it with someone who you don't have a long history with, or you're not emotionally connected to in some way,
But
so
here's the problem with that. I find that the people that I'm closest to in a one-to-one conversation, I think are more likely to have me think more deeply about it because I'm connected with them as a person. I'm not going to leave behind their idea or dismiss it as easily because I have to live with them. And so there is
well, I'm not talking
something
about someone I
about,
live with, fortunately, in this regard.
well, live with,
Yeah,
live
yeah,
with
yeah.
my community. I just
Right,
mean who
right.
I have to see every once in a while. Um, I think those are conversations that I wish were happening more often and publicly, and that we were committed to that. I think YouTube is helping, but you can hide in YouTube a little bit, right?
I'm sure.
People can say terrible things about somebody they don't even know comfortably.
Oh, just look at the comments section on anything here.
So
Okay, so
let's go to
we should probably,
Revelation.
yeah, let's get on to science here.
Oh, do you want Revelation? Do you want to talk about
Oh,
those
okay. Well,
other
I'm
ideas?
sorry. Yeah.
Let's go through those more quickly.
All right.
Revelation. you know, is specifically in the West was the Bible, or the idea that there's an authority outside of the universe who has a perfect form of knowledge, and we have to trust those who have a special connection with that being to get the best ideas. And it really is a negation of trust in self, right? It's lean not on your own understanding is the message of Revelation. Trust sources of knowledge outside of the self. So it's antithetical to trusting your own senses, measurable, or reason, which is
To
something you
me,
have within yourself.
yeah, the problem with Revelation to me it's kind of like a con man on steroids, because the con man will just try to cheat you of your money or your belongings or whatever, but the prophet wants your mind and your soul.
Right.
He
Yeah.
wants you to basically become an automaton on his behalf. That is when I hear a prophet, anybody talking about revelation, this is an oracle which you can no longer question. And you have this not only in religion, you also have it in politics as well,
Sure you
of
do.
course.
Yeah.
So anybody who's pretending to be infallible or unquestionable. I mean, generally we think of revelation as being, the person is a conduit for, like you said, an authority outside of the universe. But in the more secular sense, you could just say it's someone who is ultimately unquestionable. And so the next word right there is authority,
Authority. Yeah.
which sort of is, if we can think of these as little Venn diagrams, authority is almost like the ultimate circle here. It sort of encompasses all these other things, charisma, mysticism, divination, visions, are all sort of aspects or supports to authority, or things that authority can draw upon.
That's right.
I don't think he put these words in any particular order.
I think the appeal of revelation and authority, they're both forms of authority. Obviously, they're just different. One's a specific method of finding a source of knowledge that's
exactly
beyond
revelation
human,
is a way of
is a
attaining
type of
authority.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The main problem to me is simply that it provides you with. This is where Kant is talking about laziness. He's saying that
Really good.
there's a comfort in not having to think for yourself. It is relaxing to just go, oh well, God said X, which gives you permission to not have to think for yourself and is comforting, or right. And so I do feel like, for example, in the US right now, there is a really big impulse to have somebody come in, a savior, who can come in and just force the right things to happen, right? An authority, so that you don't have to think for yourself anymore or do anything or be a facilitator of change, somebody to do it for you. And that's scary.
You remember in 2016 when Trump was nominated at the Republican convention, and he stood up. This has got to be one of the ballsiest things that anybody's done at any public event in this country in the past 200 years. And he stands up in front of all the delegates and people there and says, I alone understand the system. I alone can fix it. Now, if any of those people, if any of the people in that audience had not been totally addled in the brain, at that point, they would have gotten out of their chairs and run for the nearest exit.
Yeah,
because everyone there and every person, Republican or otherwise, watching this dolt on TV saying this ought to have known that they were in the presence of a megalomaniac and someone who is so narcissistically unhinged and out of touch with reality. I mean, this is a guy who had 6 bankruptcies in his, on his resume. I think it's 5 or 6, I've lost count, but who has demonstrated nothing other than a penchant for, bilking and stiffing other people. I mean, those are his expertises. Yeah. So on what basis would he ever have to say that, and to actually get up and say that? But then you've got a whole damn party, a political party, and 40% of the electorate who seem to have bought into it.
Well, but I think that's because there's a craving for that. When the world is not reflecting your ideology and you feel impotent, you want somebody to come in and fix it. And that's where authority gets its power.
But
It's
all of that
indulgent.
just reflects what you were just saying, Chad, is
That's right. Yeah,
this laziness.
that's right.
And I mean, if you're a 6-year-old child, and the lights go out, you're going to look to a higher authority to fix the damn thing. Why are the lights out? And so
Yeah.
that's natural. But these are
Yeah,
adults,
it's
presumably.
natural, but that doesn't mean that it's conducive to a better world, right?
No,
To
but for a
have that happen, right?
6-year-old, I don't
Yeah.
want a 6-year-old, pulling out, opening the fuse box and fiddling around with shit. That's a great way to start a fire. 6-year-olds taking charge of the electrical apparatus is not a solution to things. But when we have a room full of adults and experts, presumably, and people who know better, ought to know better, actually sitting back and nodding their heads and cheering when this lunatic says this bullshit, that is, it's like the kid, playing with the electrical box. You can't expect anything good to come from this.
Well, and I mean, it's interesting. The next word is charisma, right? And so, which
Nailed it.
is a good
Perfect.
lead in
Yeah.
to this. I'm not sure that Donald Trump has charisma, but he
He
seems to
has an
for some
evil sort of
people.
charisma. He's clearly got
Some
something.
I'm not. There are enough people that find him charismatic
Yeah.
to be drawn to him, and actually, I do think there is something about certain people that has a bigger effect than others. Somehow, I'm not sure how to understand charisma, but some people walk into a room and they affect the room differently than other people who walk into the room. It is
Just
hard to
listen.
explain and understand that,
Just
and
listen
it's completely
to
untrustworthy.
Yeah, but just listen to people who call into talk shows, and where you've got a debate going on the talk show, and people who get on there and talk about Trump supporters, and the way that their elocution, the way that they actually speak about the man, and even if they're willing to say, oh yeah, he doesn't tell the truth all the time, but he understands business or the economy, and the
None of
conviction,
which is true.
the conviction I hear there. And then you listen to my wife, and she just has this visceral response to the absolute repugnance. I mean, this is a used car salesman who was molesting small children in the
Yeah,
back. I mean, that's the sort of
it's yeah, that's right.
visceralness that I get. To me, when I think, this is literally from the 80s, and the way that I have thought of Trump since 1980s, this is a con artist. I've
Yeah.
always, this is clearly a guy who is a slick salesman, and I wouldn't buy a damn thing he was selling. But somehow, like you said, I mean, some people find him attractive and convincing.
Yeah, I think the next one's interesting. It's a real jump from charisma. Maybe not, but
Mysticism. Now,
yeah,
yeah, that
mysticism.
word is used in all
This is a
sorts of
little more
crazy
tricky.
ways.
Yeah.
It
So
is a
what
tricky word.
it is. So mysticism is, to me, I think what he's getting at here is a sort of experiential spiritualism almost, right? That there's the otherworldly engagements that or experiences that you have that you take as otherworldly engagements, or that there's a beyond. So you meditate and you have this experience of unity with the universe, right? Which is a kind of classic mystical initial experience in meditative practice. And that doesn't mean that you understand the universe. Just because
Or
you
that
have
you're in a
this,
position to run the universe.
or that you're in a position to, yeah, but or to know anything about the
Or that you
universe.
should be running the civilization that you find yourself in at that moment.
The insights you get in mysticism do not make you comparable to physicists.
I actually don't think, I suspect, I mean, we don't have Steven Pinker here to talk to you, but when I hear that term bandied around, because you were rather specific there, and your usage there is actually how I would use it, in terms of very specific types of spiritual experiences. I think, though, the way that this word tends to be used by the general thinking public tends to be about where we may have some kind of an emotional It could even be a genuine insight kind of experience, but
Sure.
where
Yeah.
these experiences are rather, what's the term I'm thinking of here? Um, we tend to run away with them rather uncritically, and we don't have either the knowledge base to be critical about them.
Right.
We're so caught up in them and so suddenly on fire with them and so enthusiastic that we
Yeah.
don't parse. None of our judgments or pronouncements get parsed in any real considered way. So all of a sudden, if I have an experience like this while I'm in my Bible study, suddenly on fire for Ezekiel because I was reading the book of Ezekiel,
Yeah.
and it runs away with me, and I lose critical faculty. It doesn't. That's not to say that the experience itself doesn't have merit.
That's the key. That's the key. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I think most people who have these kinds of things, and I'll give you actually I'll give you a very specific example of this. So I one time was hearing Richard Dawkins. He was at some mega church, and he was talking with a pastor who clearly, it became clear, obviously based on what this guy said, that he had some sort of genuine spiritual experiences where he was talking about, a kind of electricity going up his spine and his
Yeah. Sure.
head.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Dawkins had no context within which to place that, but nor did the Christian guy. And the Christian guy was then saying, well, that's, the Holy Spirit coming down. And I'm like, dude, half the literature in India and China will go on ad nauseum about this exact
Yeah.
experience. And they actually know how to use that in an
Sure.
intelligent fashion. Okay, in India, they call it Kundalini. And in China, they call it Chi energy. And there's a bazillion things that you can do with that. It has nothing to do with, it doesn't have any justification with some magical god or deity or whatever. But Dawkins, unfortunately, doesn't have that knowledge base to talk about it because he doesn't know about those traditions. But the fact that this gentleman, the pastor, also is out of his depth and only has recourse to something which really itself, that tradition doesn't itself really understand that phenomenon and doesn't have a real context within it. So what I'm trying to say here is that things can happen to people that are, the experiences themselves are totally legitimate, but when people don't have either it's the self-critical faculty where they can kind of question it and ask, well, what really happened here? Or they don't have sort of cultural knowledge, a larger knowledge in which to maybe place that experience to have some context,
Yeah.
then they can't make sense of it. And so when they talk about it, it gets mashed up with, hey, the new age ideas or something else that is really not going to be a helpful lens through which to discuss it.
I like it. I like what you said. I think the main problem in context with this book is that with the Enlightenment, there was a different kind of focus on truth. So that's the crisis that those experiences have to figure out how to deal with, right? Because if they're happening everywhere to all humans, and each human is associating with the context they're in, the name of the God that they had that experience near, right? Or they had it in this particular context. They assign the context, the contextual cues with as causation, right? And not as items of correlation. And this is why these things are not trustworthy. I listened to a Dr. Resnick recently. I want to send you this debate with Matt Dillahunty. It was painful, but worth it. One of those ones where you're just like, really? Because both parties had their own issues. Matt started getting too aggressive partway through. I don't blame him, but I also think it would have been nice if he chilled out. But Dr. Resnick essentially said that the reason that he believes there's a spiritual realm is because he can demonstrate that if you do these certain practices, you will have these spiritual experiences. And hundreds and millions of people throughout history have validated.
I've heard this kind of argument.
Have validated these experiences, and they know that this is Krishna consciousness, right? Or this is God. And so I actually have no problem with saying that we could test this. We could say, if you do X, Y, Z, you will have this kind of experience.
Sure.
I don't have any problem. I think I wish many of these experiences could be normative, right, across
They
the board.
should be. Our culture would be vastly improved.
I don't think they guarantee positive morality, although maybe there's association. I don't think they guarantee truth. In fact, I think they don't at all. I can't say to you, I am on a video call live.
There's 1 million people watching us.
Sorry.
So she found you out in the woods in your tent.
Yeah, I know. She knocked on my tent wall and said, "Hey, you know."
See, in the Hall of Knowledge here, or the Death Star, wherever the hell it is, I am. Nobody can find me.
Yeah, yeah. So, anyways, so I wanted to get back to that. There's this. So I have no problem with that. What I don't like is going, well, therefore God. That is mysticism. So to me, when he's talking about mysticism here, it's the moment you move from describing your experience to just prescribing a conclusion.
So that's basically going from some kind of methodology to suddenly you're deducing an ontology from that.
And a morality, right? So I recently listened or read an article by a Mennonite guy that someone I talked to, a family friend, sent me and said she loved it. It was great. And I read it and I was horrified. Not because I thought this isn't a thoughtful, smart person, but because he was essentially saying that the best way to come to a universal morality is to have these mystical experiences, that these mystical experiences are a guarantor of compassion and empathy. And I felt like,
there's no real evidence of that.
What I wanted to say is, have you read the Bhagavad Gita? Like, it's horrifying what Arjuna is told he should do based on his mystical experience. He has this mystical experience about compassion, but he's supposed to go kill his family. The whole text is about convincing him to act out his dharma, his duty, which is past, essentially.
Well, of course, there is some, just in defense a little bit there is some debate about, is that literal or is this
so to
analogy?
Me, that's the same argument that you get in the Old Testament about Noah's flood. So you have Christians who, did he really kill everybody in the world? I don't believe he did, to get rid of them all. It's a metaphor. Great, fine. I'm glad you believe it's a metaphor. That says something about your morality, not something positive about the text. So if you're using your eternal soul as a permission to say death is imaginary, that when you kill someone, it's not really death. And that's the argument. Krishna explicitly is teaching Arjuna to not be afraid of death, because death is a myth. It is not real. The soul continues afterwards. Nothing's actually really functionally changing. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but as soon as you make eternity permission to not take this life seriously, you've got a contest between this life, the one we know is happening, and one we don't know is happening. And that's why the Enlightenment recenters that on this life and says, no, we can't trust mystical experiences tell us what is the proper location of morals or authority or insight, or trusting that the Holy Spirit told one person in England that these people are wrong, and they go and kill them on that basis. And these people have an experience of the Holy Spirit that tells them these people are wrong, and they go and kill them. The Civil War happens based on the Holy Spirit, and he's not very good guidance. That is evidence that explicitly the Holy Spirit is not and cannot be the guide.
It's not a reliable
source of information. And that's that's an Enlightenment insight. It is. It's one it's not an Enlightenment insight. People had that before, but the popularization of that insight, the idea of making that a part of political policy making this life the center of attention rather than the afterlife, and privatizing the religious, but publicizing the political and separating church and state. That's really what separation of church and state is about, is privatizing those experiences and saying, we can't trust them. So you can have them, but we can't trust them to navigate how to make political decisions for a whole bunch of people who believe lots of different things.
Um, okay,
Anyway,
so
divination.
divination. I mean, I don't think we have to really go.
No.
Yeah, so
Visions.
divination, visions, gut feelings, and I love this
The
hermeneutic
hermeneutic
parsing of
parsing
sacred
sacred
texts.
text.
Yeah,
He's really waxy. He gets a little too poetic there to be
yeah.
anything but like a parody, right?
No,
Yeah,
yeah. I think he's intentionally being a little bit comic there, because
yeah.
I just think of these, heavy-browed rabbis spending their entire lives, studying one word in in Deuteronomy or wherever.
Well, I mean, I think those are experiential things too. So when I became a Christian, one of the things that happened is the text became profound to me in a way it hadn't the day before when I had my spiritual experience, so to speak, my conversion experience. And I started reading the Bible, man, and it just exploded. I think these experiences are real. They
Oh no,
happen.
I've met other Christians. I had a really good a lady who I was very fond of actually when I was doing my degree, undergraduate degree. She was a fellow religion major, and I think it was in connection to her. I think it was with the text, but yeah. So basically, she had this experience, and then of course her group had to validate it in accordance to the text. I don't remember how all that worked out. She was a wonderful person. I don't think she was really any kind of a fundamentalist or anything. She was a little bit
Well,
too
I mean,
smart for
I
that.
think that these experiences really are the force that solidifies people to their ideology in a way that other things don't. If they were just ideas, people would be more cautious and willing to hold back on committing to things they can't verify or are not reliably testable. But when you have a personal experience like that, you don't want to deny this. This is the best thing that's ever happened to you. And to imagine that it doesn't have a true source, that a child could have an imaginary friend that produces the same type of experience in them potentially.
Let me push back
Terrifying.
on that there a little bit, Chad, because So for example, correct me if I'm wrong, but who was the Catholic, the really big Catholic writer in the 1200s?
Thomas
Saint
Aquinas? No,
Thomas
no.
Aquinas, yeah.
Thomas Aquinas. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, wasn't he? So he writes the Summa Theologica, which is like 12 volumes long or something. And then near the end of his life, he apparently had some kind of experience. It must have been, one of these mystical experiences. And he basically said, everything I've written was just shit. He
Yeah.
basically, so in a way, what happened to him, I don't know that granted, I don't know enough details here, but as I understand it, or as I remember reading about it, in a sense, he was sort of freed from the text by this. And I think that is kind of what happened to my classmate, if I recall, that her Bible study group or whatever kind of was trying to get her to put it all back in the box, what had happened to her. Oh yeah. Now I remember. She was walking into a pool. That's when it happened to her, and just suddenly something, the veil was lifted, so to speak. But it was clearly a non. I
Stop
don't.
it. Such
I
a mocker.
and no. That's my word. Those are my words,
Sure,
Chad.
sure.
I'm
Yeah.
not trying to make fun of her at all, because
No,
I
I know
remember
you.
having a discussion with her about this. It was clearly a life-altering event, but it was something that was non-conceptual, a non-conceptual experience that then subsequently she told me how when she talked about this with her study group, they were immediately trying to get her to put it back into the box of the text. And the impression that, in what I remember, was that was not going to work out so easily. And I don't know how she parsed that out with them, eventually, but I can easily see a lot of people, um, in your case, clearly it kind of got you more into the text, but some of that may just be because of the kind of person you are. You clearly have an attraction to ideas and the written word.
My point
But
wasn't
I
about the
could,
text, just so you know, Craig. Just so
what's
you
that?
don't, just so you're not keeping going on that
Okay.
track, thinking that I meant that. I didn't mean that. for me, the opening up of the text, it was my experience. It is a common one, but it's not obviously the only one. My main point was to say that it's really hard to become unhinged from your belief in the thing that you believe in once you've had that experience, not related to the text specifically, but how do you give up on the idea that there is a God if you have one of these profound experiences and it's the best thing that's ever happened to you? And then what are you going to say? Well, it didn't come from God. It was made up in my head, right? Like it was just like a psychological effect. That's not sufficient. We want more. We're greedy, right? And that's what I call spiritual greed, is this idea that it's what we have is not enough for us. We need so much more. And so the whole idea of spirit and mysticism to me comes from a natural greed that we have. Those who have it, survive better. And we're happier because they saw meaning beyond this life, because it was so shitty. But once we were able to survive without that impulse, we can reflect a little bit better on whether it's true or not. Its survivability, its ability to help us survive is maybe one of the explanations for why we're capable of having these experiences. Our ancestors who didn't have their brain perfectly matched to reality, their experiences perfectly matched reality, were able to survive better. I mean, it's not an unreasonable idea. I don't know if it's true or whatever, but it's at least in practice or in principle testable. But those experiences, how do you become unhinged from that? Very few people, when they go into a religious community and have an experience, are going to leave. But if they don't get it, if they pray and nothing ever happens, it becomes a lot easier to reject the text, reject everything.
Yeah, no, I think so. For example, if you look at people who are in cults and what have you, I think what you're saying is clearly the case.
It's not arguments. In other words, it's not
Yeah,
William Lane Craig's ontological argument or
that gets you to stay with
or
that
Alvin
group.
Plantinga's that inspires you to enter it in the first place, or
Right,
to stick around with your group.
Yeah,
it's the experience. It's
right.
anchored in the experience, and then if you have an experience while you're reading the text, it's profound. Like Thomas Aquinas. If you go back to what you're talking about, his experience didn't negate his attachment to the text, only to the method he was using to understand it.
Yeah, that may well be the case. Yeah.
So I think
I'm not really that closely familiar
versus,
with Thomas Aquinas.
Reason versus experience, right? And all of a sudden he goes, well, once you have this experience, this reason stuff,
you don't need reason.
Secondary, right? You just it's not relevant anymore.
Yeah.
Because it feels a lot better than reason. So anyways, gut feelings, parsing. Okay, so let's just quickly go through the last three here real quick. The second one is
science.
Second idea, science, the refining of reason to understand the world. So it's interesting that he says here the refining of reason, right? Because he's basically saying reason is non-negotiable, but it can't do it on its own. He's implying in that first sentence that reason needs to be refined by something. And so reason is an internal method, but he's saying there's a method that we need to add to it in order to make it much more trustworthy than it is on its own.
So, so he gives a paragraph here, which I found to be absolutely delightful. It's actually
I love it.
Pinker. It's actually the historian David Wooten.
It's a good quote.
And so the comparison here, this is really, really wonderful, where he compares someone, say, an English person in the year 1600 versus an educated descendant of that person 100 years later, who has sort of imbibed or processed what the Enlightenment has kind of brought to bear over the past century. And I mean, we can read that, but what I was trying to do was distill like what are the mistaken beliefs? What are the mistaken ways of thinking here? In other words,
the list that we just walked through?
Well, no. So there's the list of beliefs, but then I was asking myself, well, how can you distill these
Oh, I
down.
see. Sure.
How are people coming to these beliefs? And
Magical
so
thinking. Yeah.
and I was saying, okay, mistaking correlation for causation,
Oh, okay. You got it.
wishful thinking,
Yeah.
believing things because a number of other people say it is so. In other words, thus it is said. So there's social cohesion or social pressure.
Yeah.
Believing because a text says it is so, which is textual authority. Magical thinking. Now, I'm not claiming that that's a
No, sure.
complete listing, but
There are hundreds and hundreds of ways that we make logical errors, right? I mean,
I was trying to come up with a way of better understanding these. Yeah,
fallacious
so
reasoning. Fallacious reasoning. I mean,
yeah, but I mean, there's lots of different types of
that's
fallacious
right.
reasoning,
Yeah.
and I was trying to like get in, like, well, how do people? He has seen a unicorn's horn, but not a unicorn. But we don't question the fact that there are unicorns, and
Right.
other
Yeah.
things. I mean, it's
So can I throw out there a little addition to this that really
yeah.
to me, nails it? Is I prefer the word caution or modesty to name what's happening in a generalized way. Epistemological caution or modesty is helpful because
In
what
relation to this
well,
this paragraph here.
not being willing to not to separate out conjecture or wish or what you might fear to be true or wish to be true from what you can demonstrate to be true. And so, and assigning belief only to what you can demonstrate proportionally. So Hume, to me, stands out in all of this because he basically says, just proportion your belief to the evidence. That's skepticism in a
Yeah. Oh,
nutshell,
I love that. That's a perfect
right?
statement. Yeah.
So it's proportional. So you don't, if you see a hoof print, you don't go, well,
That's a
unicorn.
unicorn. Unicorns must
Right.
exist.
You're not allowed. And no matter how many people have dreams that night about unicorns, you're cautious, you withhold. Unless you have prior knowledge, you don't build a case for something new, some novel thing, unless you can demonstrate it. And
Yeah.
so that kind of caution. So in other words, you had a worldview in which all of these beliefs, like millions of metaphysical beliefs were possible, shrink down and go, listen, let's tighten the frame of reference. And so the metaphor that I has been helpful to me is to think of this as prior to the Enlightenment, the world was living on a balcony without a railing. And it didn't know the difference between the edge where the leap of faith starts and where the railing should be. Right. And so to me, the railing is skepticism. It is scientific methodology, because what it does is it actually makes you feel safer. Do you feel safer on a balcony without a railing or one with a railing? You actually feel more free, more able to understand the world. Your mind is cleaned a little bit when you have a railing, and you can hang out on the balcony without worrying that you might be jumping off the edge and there might be no bottom. Right. And so to me, science is cautionary. It's cautious. It moves slowly, but everything got sped
There's
up
another way
at the same
so
time.
if you read this paragraph, there's the werewolves, there's the witches, there's
Yeah.
all these crazy things. So sort of the pre-enlightenment, post-enlightenment, I would say that the pre-enlightenment world is a world in which imagination is unhinged.
Right.
Basic
Unframed. Yeah.
whatever people come up with, if there are enough of us who come up with that and we talk about it, we can believe it and assert that it's the case. And so then once we do have some, sort of guides to thinking, then we're a little bit, as you say, more cautious. Our imagination, we can still use our imagination, but it's going to be used in a more targeted fashion.
I
It's
think
going to
the
be
key
used
is
in a
that
more
how do you separate out what is a product of the imagination from what is in the category of real? And those two things are opposites, and science is really good at separating out what is imaginary from what is real. And it's actually,
well, when I was using the word imagination, I wasn't
yeah,
equating
you're
that
just
to
mean the
imaginary.
faculty, right?
Yeah, the faculty of thinking and conceptualizing and proliferating,
Sure,
and because let's face it,
fair enough.
science is essentially imagination, but it's imagination that's been trained and
Tested.
targeted and is being used in a very specific manner, as opposed to undisciplined imagination.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Yeah, I like that.
So, okay, now this what I thought was really important here. He says at the bottom of page 9.
Collective
So,
paranoia,
so
yeah.
a century and a third later, an educated descendant of this Englishman would believe none of these things, all that stuff. And he says it was an escape not just from ignorance, but from terror. And
That's
maybe
what I meant by the balcony.
this is the terror of not having a balcony. The sociologist Robert Scott notes that in the Middle Ages, quote, the belief in an external force controlled daily life contributed to a kind of collective paranoia.
Yeah.
And I wrote
Can you
here.
Can you read that next paragraph? Can you read that? Is that okay?
Well, yeah, I will. But let me just, my point here that I immediately, when I saw that, I wrote, so, and what I was saying is that these beliefs are actually the result of powerlessness. And that what science kind of gave us was power and confidence. And then I wrote in big letters, not arrogance. So confidence here does not imply arrogance, but
no, it doesn't. And in fact, it's modesty. So like the modesty that matters to me isn't the modesty related to a person. It's related to the system. Is your system modest in its endeavors? So you go to a church,
or its claims.
I go to one of my old churches or whatever, and you find anybody willing to say that they know how the universe began, right? And I dare you to find a scientist willing to say that at a scientific conference. Now, the scientist might, in person, as a person, generally be more arrogant than the pastor claiming to know how the universe began, but their methods are their inverse of their personalities.
Right. Yeah.
That's what matters. Is the method modest in its orientation?
Okay, so you wanted to read this paragraph?
Just so what you said, you had read that this thing about ignorance but terror. So the big problem wasn't it wasn't that it was an escape from ignorance, it's that socially it was an escape from terror. And then you read that in the Middle Ages, the belief that an external force controlled daily life contributed to a kind of collective paranoia. So we have this paragraph in which this guy believes that a murdered body will bleed in the presence of the murderer. He believes that there is an ointment which, if rubbed on the dagger, will cause a wound. He will cure the wound. He believes that the shape, color, and texture of a plant can be a clue to how it will work as medicine because God designed nature to be interpreted by mankind. I mean, he believes Circe really did turn Odysseus' crew into pigs. He believes mice are spontaneously generated in piles of straw, etc. And there's this big list of things that 100 years prior, everybody believed. And then, wow, talk about living in a paranoid world where you never know what the hell is going to happen.
Well, so that's what I meant, is that I think that it's powerlessness is the problem.
Powerlessness.
So,
it proves your point.
Yeah.
And I think that this next one is being able to create the contrast is helpful here. So
what do you want me to read that?
This other guy believe? Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. So this
other guy,
so the other guy, the guy a century later, rainstorms, thunder, lightning, wind gusts, solar or lunar eclipses, cold snaps, heat waves, dry spells, and earthquakes alike were considered signs and signals of God's displeasure. As a result, the hobgoblins of fear inhabited every realm of life. The sea became a satanic realm, and forests were populated with beasts of prey, ogres, witches, demons, and very real thieves and cutthroats.
So this isn't the contrast.
So this is still pre-Enlightenment.
Pre-Enlightenment,
However, to the Enlightenment thinkers, the escape from ignorance and superstition showed how mistaken our conventional wisdom could be, and how the methods of science, skepticism, fallibilism, open debate, and empirical testing are a paradigm of how to achieve reliable knowledge. Yeah, so my response when I was reading that was I saw all this as being the symptoms of a group of people who knew in their bones that they were truly powerless in the face of the natural world and the plagues and the floods and whatever the hell else might, beset you. And, we create beliefs. If I throw salt over my shoulder in the morning, or my right shoulder, I know that the day will be good and the gods will look favorably upon me. So this is clearly a way of giving myself a sense of confidence that I actually know what the hell is going on, even though I don't really know what the hell is going
Well, unless we had a way to replace that was actually more in touch with reality, we we wouldn't have. So it's interesting. The methods of science you can see as almost like a substitute for superstitious habits or patterns, right? If you tap your bat, I had a really good hit when I was playing baseball. When I right before that, I ate a banana, right? And so every time now you eat a
Henceforth, you were eating
banana,
bananas before you played
right?
baseball.
Though that kind of thinking is,
The sports figures are filled with that kind of stuff. I've heard.
yeah.
Oh
And
shoot!
there may be some value to it in terms of practical value, but the problem is the mixing of use value and truth value um, was overwhelming. And so I think what science did was help separate out uh, the practical, personal use value of an idea, how it comforted you, from what was legitimately true or capable of being demonstrated. That's really what happened.
So you want to hit number
I want
three?
to say something about fallibilism. So
Oh
I
yeah,
don't know.
sure.
So fallibilism, just so we're on the same page there. The value of fallibilism is that certainty is not a prerequisite for knowledge. That knowledge claims can be proportional to the evidence, right? So that you never assume that you absolutely know anything. And that's the kind of modesty that we're talking about in science, that until all the data is in, you can't claim there's certainty, and then all
And
the
all
data
the
will
data will
never
never
come
be
in.
in.
And
Yeah.
you don't wait until all the data comes in. But that's why you call it a theory. You don't theory, people think of theory and facts as the highest order thing in science. It's not. The theory is higher. It's considered a higher standard than just facts. Facts are impotent, they're irrelevant
Well,
without
facts are, that's just another word for data.
it's
So
another word for
we have
data.
we have
So
data points that we're using to construct a theory.
that's right.
And then we
Yeah.
get more data to test and see if that
That
theory
theory
is in fact
continues to
holding up.
maintain a whole, yeah, or if it's as accurate as it could be, because we've come to understand that math is a heuristic. It represents reality, it doesn't determine it. And so the math that we come up with is just the best model we have for understanding and describing what's happening.
So to kind of loop this back a little bit to what we were earlier going through, the whole notion of revelation. So imagine that scientific theory is that I'm trying to get my hand to show up here. This is very
Yeah,
difficult.
there you go.
Yeah. Okay. If theory, scientific theory, is at one end of the spectrum, then here we go. Revelation, I would argue, is at the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
In that, because revelation, no one tests revelation. It's by definition, you can't replicate Jesus's resurrection or any of the prophets' revelations. But on the other hand, a scientific theory is inherently iterative. We're always testing it and refining it.
It's
And
always open to
the
revision.
moment it can no longer encompass the data that we have assembled, we have to toss it out or improve upon.
So that's one thing that's different. That's what you're describing there is the opposite of dogma. So a theory replaced dogma as a priority concept, because what a dogma is if this is your hand holding the idea, you've got your idea right here. Dogma says you're only gonna be an insider in this group if you hold the dogma like this. You have to accept it, regardless of what evidence there might be to justify or undermine it. And it's of course
preferably that you don't look for any other evidence.
That's right. What I mean is there is almost this violence metaphor that comes along with that, because you hold it no matter what.
Yeah.
You don't and it becomes like a fist, whereas science holds it like a theory, calls it a theory, and says that your hand has to always be open, or you're an arrogant prick. You miss it. You're going to be biased. You're going to be. You don't defend. You don't be loyal to science, to truth. Truth and loyalty are incompatible as methods of understanding the world, right? As soon as you're faithful to your idea, your God, in the face of contradictory evidence, you're less and less likely to be in line with what's real. So loyalty, that's why I think loyalty right now is the pinnacle value in the US, and that's what's underlying.
Yeah, well, that's clearly Trump's main value. Yeah,
so anyways,
he's made that clear.
Yeah, so reliable knowledge. Then the third
humanism.
idea after this is humanism, and this is where we enter into the moral realm, right? Where we decide what is it that's a priority. Human well-being, human flourishing is the goal, and morality that serves that is worthy of the Enlightenment because it serves human well-being and has that as its aim. And so it puts the human realm on center stage rather than the
So
spiritual realm. We're no longer saying, well, you can do these things to these people. You can put these women through these virginity tests, because what matters isn't their experience now. We can make them suffer now or burn them at the stake if they don't, because we want to save their souls, because the afterlife is more important than this one. And so human suffering is not the key concern, salvation is. Whereas what the Enlightenment did is say, no, center stage is this life, and morality has to be based on our experiences of events here. And the world became tangibly easier to tolerate. You have, all of a sudden you have fewer torture systems. We move increasingly from a system of torture to a public torture to one of incarceration, rehabilitation eventually, and the scope, the expansion of sympathy starts to happen, right? Accordingly.
so it seems to me that reading this section, what he was mainly so he there's a couple things here. So humanism privileges well-being of individuals over the glory of tribe, race, nation, religion.
Yeah.
And so first off, tribe, race, nation, religion, these are all ultimately ideological. So the human well-being, human flourishing has to supersede any ideological concern we have, and also it universalizes.
Well, and race to me is dubious as an idea anyways. I'm not sure that it has a tangible, a real a scientific meaning. I'm not sure it makes any sense in the
Yeah,
context
I'm just laying out the
just an
various
interest.
things.
I'm just throwing that out as an
Yeah.
interesting,
No, I see what you're saying.
Science creates problems for some of
Those
these
are that's literally
ideologies.
the list of words that he had in there. And,
Yeah, well, I'm saying race doesn't make sense in the context of science.
right,
Tribe
right.
doesn't make sense in the context of
No.
science. And humanism is the outpouring of this kind of thinking, right?
Yeah. So I was saying right here, my notes, replaces ideology with concern for capacity of person to suffer or flourish. So it's very much an individual. You're looking at individuals. You're starting with the individual as a kind of building block, and what
Yeah.
is the impact of our behavior and our thinking and our systems upon the ability of a person to, to
It,
to to grow, to enjoy, their life.
I think one thing that's a bit of a weakness here that I think he could make more explicit is how the Enlightenment essentially aimed to find a standard that was universal, was not applicable to the tribe, but was applicable to humanity as a whole. And I do think sympathy is the standard ultimately that I think the Enlightenment came up with, but it also suggested that everybody's well-being mattered. We had terms like common sense. So all of a sudden, everybody had the same capacity to experience the world and come to conclusions based on those experiences, sensory experiences, and evaluate them and test them. And this became available to everybody. So the ability to generalize morality outside of the scope of your own local church, like, right, is what was unique about the Enlightenment and generalizing well-being, because the Enlightenment didn't actually just focus on the individual. It made the individual the center of attention in a
So
way that
are you saying that you're kind of pointing out a weakness in his
yeah,
text here?
I think that the sympathy thing he nails, right? The idea
Uh-huh.
that sympathy, it is the concept, whether you were, especially in Western Europe, where you have France and well, Germany's not really there yet, but England and all those areas, they're talking about sympathy, pity, compassion as the thing that we all have in common. That's why we called it the sympathetic nervous system, right? Because we believed that we all had this intrinsic ability to morally trust each other. In other words, you didn't need to rely on authority or revelation or anybody else to guide you morally. You had it built into you in the fibers of your own body. That's what they believed, right? And so in other words, not only do you have reason and empirical knowledge to be able to understand the world, which is in you, you have a sympathetic nervous system. So your intellect and your morality don't need sources of knowledge outside of the self to guide you. You have those resources within you. That's how the individual gets center stage. But the moralities that come, the moral thinking that comes out of this era is largely collectivist. Utilitarianism is at the pinnacle of this moral, and a lot of this is collectivist in its orientation, trying to maximize well-being for the most while still maintaining individuality. So there's more of a dialectic happening between collectivism and individualism than he's suggesting.
So how because again, I have a little bit of a beef here with him, because he's not really defining the term. And
Humanism?
Yeah, humanism. I mean, unless I just missed it.
Yeah.
I mean, so he says the idea of a universal human nature. Perhaps that's
it.
the
That's all I'm
definition.
talking about. But he doesn't really explain the significance of that idea.
Yeah, because I think that's so. I mean,
it's a crazy idea historically.
If I were just to riff on that, I would say, okay, if this is, if I have something which is, if my fundamental concerns as a person who's living and trying to survive in the world, if my fundamental concerns, my feelings on how I am day to day, if this is something which anybody in any tribe anywhere can experience, then that precedes and supersedes anything that I might believe about the world. That's something which we could literally test that out. If I was able to translate my moment-to-moment experience into the language of an Inuit Eskimo, we could identify very definite facts. Do you love your child? Do you hurt when someone sticks you with a pin? Et cetera, et cetera. You can go down the list of all the ways that you can experience the world. And then we could start to understand, well, these things are valuable. These are the things we want to cultivate. And these are the things we want to avoid, whether we live in a very small group or whether we live in a big city like London or whatever. To me, that kind of thinking is the kind of thinking, and I'm just riffing here, but that to me is fundamentally a kind of humanistic thinking, because it cuts out any kind of tribal or preceding ideology that would tend to divide people. It's looking at the most common elements of human experience and value. Right. that I think anybody, I literally cannot think of even the most primitive and out there tribe that would not in some way come back to those sorts of experiences and say, yes, we value these. We want to avoid these other things.
Yeah.
If everybody's killing everybody, if a father wakes up and then in that morning carves up his daughter and eats her for breakfast, how many civilizations would say, oh, that's a good way to be,
Well, I mean, it's those ideas are not sustainable, right? So it's
right, exactly.
Practically dysfunctional. So there's
just from an evolutionary standpoint, they don't work.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think we need to go down the road of saying that what is good helps us survive, because who knows what that really means. But I do think that well-being is a term that I actually think is helpful, even though it's a loose and baggy monster in a way, because as soon as you assign a goal, you can objectively determine whether your actions are producing that goal.
Yeah.
Of course, well-being is subjectively chosen, and that's what you're getting at. Where are you going to find somebody who doesn't find well-being to be a worthy objective for themselves? People will just say, well, what if his well-being means he wants you to eat his arm? And they'll come up with these extreme examples of it being subjective. Well, I don't care if it's subjective. It is generally what we all want. And if eating his arm is conducive to his well-being, well, how do we handle that, right? Like, that's the question.
Yeah, and I also think that those kind of examples are not really helpful from an argumentative standpoint, because there is no tribe or civilization that has ever existed where the de facto value was, hey, my neighbor should eat my arm.
Right.
That just doesn't fly.
But nowadays you can find people, if will be willing to do it, right? So it's interesting. How does a society handle that, in which certain fantasies of well-being are really isolated to a narrow group of people? How do you handle that? Do you make it illegal? What do you do?
Well, I mean,
But
now we're
that's
kind of,
where
yeah, now we're kind of
now,
going into the question of mental illness and
well,
confinement and yeah,
maybe, but
possibly, yeah.
but what I mean is that frame gives us the ability to have the conversation and
Yeah.
have a target and have a goal that we all can agree to, because even the person who wants to have their arm eaten, the objective, right? So it is still the target, and that's why it's capable of producing conversations that are worth having.
Well, that was the
For
basis
all,
actually of
for all
Sam
basis.
Harris's
Yeah,
book
yeah. So
on,
Sam
yeah,
Harris and
moral
others too.
landscape.
It's basically, he's taking the utilitarian argument and trying to demonstrate how we could come to objective conclusions about what is good or bad if we start with the goal of well-being. When you have objectivity is interesting in the world of humanism, because how can you make morals objective? People don't believe you can. Well, you can. You can do it the same way that you would make temperature objective. There's no intrinsic measurement for temperature. What we did is we arbitrarily went boiling 100.
Oh,
We went
Celsius, yeah.
freezing
Freezing
0
0, yeah.
and we had to even add the proviso that it was at sea level.
Yeah.
Because it's different at different places.
Yeah.
But as soon as we assign those two things, we can make that's subjective. It's a subjective overlay. It's a standard.
Hot and cold are subjective. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we can make them objective.
No. I'm not talking about hot and cold. I'm talking about 100 and 0 at those particular,
yeah.
at 0 being, freezing and 100 being boiling. Why? Well, we chose it that way. That's it. It's a subjective choice. But once you make that subjective standard, now you and I can have a conversation about what is an objective one, about what the temperature is outside. To me, it's the same thing in morality. Maximal pleasure, maximal suffering. It's just like temperature. If we assign good to maximal pleasure or happiness or well-being, then we can make measurements about whether certain things are conducive to that or whether they maximize suffering.
Or what the fallback that Sam always uses is the concept of health. So clearly, someone who is dead is not healthy. Even though they wanted to be dead, we can agree that they're not
generally
healthy.
It's better to be alive than dead.
So, and then you've got someone who is alive, but they're catatonic or whatever. So hopefully, if we're talking about well-being, we're at least talking about someone who is able to walk about upright and take care of their daily business. So even there, I mean, that's actually quite objective. So we could talk about health in that way. Well, and I think well-being is something else that I'm sure we could easily put, measurements and parameters on. This is all within the context of humanism, right? I'm kind of losing track on where we are.
Sorry. The reason that I'm saying this is because the conversations that we're having in philosophy right now, especially around utilitarianism, Josh Green, his book on moral tribes is an effort to put forward Enlightenment models of morality that do not have God at their center or do not have an arbitrary assignment of well-being outside of this life being the priority. So instead of having well-being the focus of the well-being in the afterlife being the focus, because then you can say anything. If you eat fish on Sundays, you're going to go to hell. So don't eat fish on Sundays, and that's about well-being. It's still the measure. Yeah. It's just that it's a measure. The measure is your well-being in the afterlife, not in this life. And so what humanism
which is totally
I was just going to say what humanism is essentially the transformation of the location.
The value is all on this life.
Yeah. It's such a big deal. I mean, it can't be overstated how strange that is historically.
So I agree it is strange historically within the context of Western Europe and Christianity. But if you think about it, I mean, the ancient Jews, the Bible has very little, the Old Testament has very little talk about any kind of an afterlife, Sheol or something.
Yeah, but even the Greeks, land. But it was a promised land.
Yeah, the Greeks had very little concern about, oh my God, if I do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to end up in the bad place or the good place. I would say also look at Chinese religion. So you don't, I mean, Confucianism was clearly not, Confucianism was very this world, this culture, this society focused. In fact, that's why early Westerners, when they first encountered and began to get familiar with Chinese culture and thinking, they dismissed Confucianism as not a religion.
Sure.
They said it wasn't a real religion. Then,
I'm not sure it is, but yeah.
yeah, I'm not saying it is or is not. That's a different discussion to have. But the fact that it was this world here and now focused, and you can say that it was wrongly focused. You can say that it was inappropriate in what it was valuing, but it
I'm not
was
saying that
not
was a universal
otherworldly
problem.
focused.
No, I'm not saying that was a universal problem. Well, all I
Right,
mean
right.
is uh, in the West, what transformed the West was a relocation of trust to
That
this.
I agree with. Yeah, because Christianity clearly had a history of being very much focused on an afterlife, and that was 1,500 years that focus had been there at
But you
least.
do have a mixture of ancestor guidance in some of these. There, and to me, there most societies had metaphysically located moralities. So even if they weren't
Oh,
most,
you mean where the results or the repercussions of what you do is going to be decided by some otherworldly power or
transcendent
something.
something.
Right. Oh yeah, no,
So
that's
all I
yeah.
mean is it's not it wasn't a physically oriented model. It was
I
a
see what you're saying. Yeah.
metaphysically oriented
Yeah.
model, even if it made this life the center stage, like the Greeks did, for example. I mean, you didn't going to hell. There was no hell or heaven. There was just this place
Yeah,
you
I never got that sense they were too worried about
Hades.
that.
They didn't want to go there because it wasn't interesting like this life, right?
No,
Right?
in fact,
No risk.
Hades is depicted as really boring.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
just
The
um
afterlife is boring. The
yeah.
gods were in some ways jealous of humans because they could die. So a god can't really demonstrate courage because they're not really risking anything in battle.
No. Yeah.
So, and that's why it was humanist, is because humans were the center of everything. The gods were just humans were or gods were in the theater, and it was the humans who were acting out that were relevant, right? So the gods are always walking around serving or trying to promote the humans they liked, and the humans were really on the center stage for the Greeks.
That is kind of funny that in order to have any kind of entertainment, they had to constantly be interfering in our affairs.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah. Because I mean, how many affairs can you have with somebody in eternity, and it
I
be
don't know.
interesting, right? I don't know.
So let's it's actually getting on towards my dinner time here.
Yep.
So
Progress.
let's make progress.
Yeah, well, I know. We've gone
Number
on and on.
4, elimination of cruel punishments.
Yeah, yeah,
That's progress.
yeah. Well,
Slavery, all of which are justified by religion.
yes. Well,
Yeah.
progress is more in terms of a new understanding of time at this period. I'm not sure he really does full justice to that, but the main thing that happens in this period is Walter Benjamin calls it the angel of nature, or the angel of history. Essentially, turns his back on the past, and everything starts to pile up and be left behind. So there's this idea that if that direction over there is the past, the old model said you look to some guiding system from the past, Jesus or Aristotle or Confucius or some source, and it was mimetic. You were to imitate that person and go forward by looking at what they did, and have your guidance to go
That's the
forward by
definition
looking
of conservatism.
of going backwards, right? Sure. But progress, the idea was that history unfolds by a process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So that's forward moving, because you have these models where it's not just you locked into these forever opposites. It's one idea, human nature is evil. Another idea comes back, somebody goes, nope, human nature is good. Adam Smith comes along and says, nope, we're both sympathetic and uh, able to be caring to others. So we're good. And we're self-interested. We're bad. Synthesis. And all of a sudden you have progress. And so you get a more and more accurate representation of reality over time, and you're forward oriented. What made that possible? Well, what made that possible is no longer having to trust revelation, no longer having to trust authority, no longer having to trust dogma. And you could turn your back on those things. Why? Because you had the resources to come to real conclusions about, or to come to conclusions about reality that were warranted by using your reason and your senses and your own sympathy to guide you. You had the resources to understand the world in yourself. You didn't need to find it outside of yourself anymore.
So he makes a very important point here, and this,
which
I
page are
think,
you
so
going
this
to?
is, I think part of it is on page 12, where he's saying that progress is always linked to humanism. And this is in connection with the notion that focus is not on progress in human nature, but in human institutions.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so
I agree with
partly, I think he was.
I like that insight.
Well, I think he was subverting a potential criticism, and this is the criticism that always gets thrown at atheists. Oh, well, look at all the communists, the Nazis
Right.
and Marxists. You would love North Korea, wouldn't you? But they're the
That's
whole
what
notion.
atheism produces. Atheism is the cause of that.
Right. So I think that what he's responding to here is the notion that there are philosophies that present themselves as making progress in history. And of course, the Marxists, when they got in power, were always using that as kind of a justification for why they were there. Well, we're making, you don't want to be back with those bourgeoisie exploiting
That's
all
right.
the peasants
That's
and what
something
have
to
you.
be left behind.
We're making progress, but the point here being that you can't claim to be making progress while you're locking people up in gulags.
That's right. That's why humanism has to be.
Yeah, and so the link here, progress is
Good point. Yeah.
is never something that is somehow divorced from. Well, it's progress in human well-being that we're talking about.
Exactly.
If you're talking about some other progress, like like our machines are so damn good, you're going to love this Death Star.
That is a type of
This is a type of progress. If I'm in the Death Star, I don't know where I am, but if this is the Death Star, they clearly have made progress beyond us, but not the kind of progress we're really talking about here. This is not the progress the Enlightenment was really focusing on here. That's technical progress. It's not moral progress. It's certainly not humanistic progress.
No, so he's talking about, I think you're right. He's suggesting that progress is specific to that period. What progress means is moral progress.
It has to be. Otherwise, you could have you could just be developing more and more awesome killing machines.
Right.
So in effect,
the Matrix, if we end up in the Matrix with machines,
that's not progress.
That is not progress.
And that's sure as hell not the Enlightenment ideal being fulfilled.
No, that's right.
And so I'm just trying to get my notes here so I don't. Yeah, so focus on progress in not on human nature, but in human institutions. And so he kind of was saying, like what you were just earlier pointing out, is that, human nature is obviously, whatever it is, it's something that is not going to be changing anytime soon. So if we are going to make improvements, it's not going to be by somehow re-engineering our souls. It's going to have to be in making the structures that we all live with, the political structures, even the architectural structures or whatever. It's going to have to be making these things better, more humane, somehow things that will bring out our better nature to kind of.
And I actually think that's where the religions may end up having a positive effect over time, especially if the ideological elements are left behind, because experientially, I think some of the stuff that happens within religion is worth understanding better. I still value my experience, the experiences I've had in Christianity and in meditation, but I just don't think they have anything to do with God. I don't think there's any real evidence to suggest that that's the source.
Well, so and one thing I wrote down here was the fact that the Enlightenment figures or thinkers were focusing on human institutions. Notice that is the time when social theory. So, for example, economics and theories of governance. And this is where the founding fathers of the United States come in, because none of that kind of thinking was really possible in a serious analytical or systematic way, I think, before they had kind of bought into this notion of progress.
Yeah, right.
That is the whole field of economics is born at that time. It's not a coincidence that that's when Adam Smith, wrote his stuff. And Adam Smith was not just an economist; he also wrote books on morality.
Yeah, that's what I did
Nature
my
of morality.
dissertation on. That's
Yeah.
what I mean, that's my dissertation.
Okay, so
Adam
here's
Smith.
your
Yeah, I know
here's
him like
your
the back of my
wheelhouse.
hand. Yeah.
I haven't read that book, but I'm at least aware of that
The
fact.
theory of moral sentiments is basically one of the earliest sociology texts.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got sociology. He's basically an expert at that time, an expert in sociology and in economic thinking.
Yeah, it's more high level philosophical thinking about that stuff. It's not yet a science, but it is based in this life, and so it is. He's basically, with the concept of sympathy, trying to find the social analog for what Newton found in the term gravity, to explain how physical relations happen in the universe. So he saw sympathy as the equivalent of gravity in the social sphere, as the equivalent in the social sphere of what gravity was in the physical sphere.
So some other stuff on page 13, he actually goes in a bit to Adam Smith.
Yeah.
Where was it?
He's talking, I think, more about economics, I think. Oh, no, he's not.
Yeah, so that middle paragraph.
Yeah, let's read that.
Yeah, I actually wrote an extensive note on this. I'll go ahead and read that. So, specialization works only in a market that allows the specialists to exchange their goods and services. And Smith explained that economic activity was a form of mutually beneficial cooperation, a positive sum game in today's lingo. Each gets back something that is more valuable to him than what he gives up. And that's absolutely critical. No economic system can work if people aren't thinking that way. Through voluntary exchange, people benefit others by benefiting themselves. And this, to me, is my concept of enlightened self-interest. As he wrote, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, end quote. Smith was not saying that people are ruthlessly selfish, or that they ought to be. He was one of history's keenest commentators on human sympathy. He only said that in a market, whatever tendency people have to care for their families and themselves can work to the good of all. And so what I wrote here on the side is something that is kind of a pet peeve of mine. Note that only a system can make personal self-interest work for the greater good. So people have to get together collectively. And this can be a conscious, deliberated choice, or it can be something that evolves over time, where a community, and then in a larger sense, a nation state and a collection of nation states, a system is worked out that requires thought and modulation, and like science, it has to be iterative. It has to be self-correcting. So if we have an economic system like the current system today, where we're all working and scurrying like, busy little mice on our wheels, and all of the benefits accrue to, 1 or 2% of the population, this is a system that is eating itself and is not going to last very long. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and so it's a system that is antithetical to the notion of progress as the Enlightenment conceived it. It's an immoral system because it's not contributing to the larger, the benefit, the well-being, as we've talked about it, of any large number of people. Most people actually aren't really benefiting. So I do think we can all be self-interested, but we have to be self-interested in a way that is enlightened. And we say, hey, Chad, I want to maximize my well-being, but if that is going to make it impossible for you to continue to contribute to the well-being that's going to keep my well-being going, then we need to look at that system, because eventually the whole damn thing is going to go down in ruin.
It is a balancing act between the collective and the individual, right? And a kind of oscillation in terms of the focus in your attention. If the individual is being left behind, you have to shift the focus to the individual. But as soon as the individual gets a priority and the collective gets left behind, you have to address the collective.
Yeah.
And that's how self-interest and sympathy work, right? So sympathy works along the horizontal plane of democratic relations, and self-interest works on the hierarchical plane of competition. So you have competition and compassion, right? I mean, those are the two kind of focal points of modernity in terms of the balancing act. And the ideal, of course, is where's the meeting place between compassion and competition, right? It's that point of contact where both of them are serving the interests of the most people as possible.
So this brings me to a little thing. Before we got online here, I was trying to figure out how to put notes up onto the channel.
Oh, that's easy.
No, well, on the actual channel, I didn't really see how to do that, because I was going to post my notes, but then what you just said reminded me of, you had talked earlier about
the diagram, yeah,
doing some little diagrams and things. And unfortunately, I haven't figured out how to post show notes. And if you know how to do that,
sure. You just go to you go down to share screen.
So we do it actually within Zoom?
Yeah, you just go to share screen.
No, I mean like going into the YouTube channel and posting it on the YouTube channel so that people can see show notes.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Secondary notes. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, there's got to be a way to do that.
Yeah.
We'll figure that out, because I mean you clearly have a lot of thoughts on that you need to put up. I'm just thinking there was something else here. There's a lot of writing.
Okay, so before we go, let's talk about what we're doing next. Just as a reminder, he does throw in peace at the end of this. He says this brings us to another enlightenment ideal, peace. So he says there are 4, but then
where is that?
It's on the bottom of page 13. He does throw in peace as a sort of tertiary or whatever.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. War was so common in history that it was natural to see it as a permanent part of the human condition, and to think peace can only come in a messianic age. And then they laid out, well, how can we have peace?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and one last thing. Oh, I know this is too much. I'm throwing too much. He says, if you extol reason, this is on page 14, the last paragraph of the chapter. It says, if you extol reason, then what matters is the integrity of the thoughts, not the personalities of the thinkers. So in other words, he's trying to say what we're taking off of center stage is the idea of nobility versus, the common person.
Yeah.
And what matters is your capacity for thought. Is the thought itself worthy? You are relevant. As a person, your thought is relevant to that. What matters in terms of your ability to participate in the world using reason is the quality of your thoughts, not something about your nobility, your bloodline, or anything.
How good my jaw is,
or how good looking you are.
I have a really good jaw. Actually, it's a little bit too big, but
right. Well, and this made it possible over time to imagine a world in which women got to participate on center stages as much as men, because if it's their thoughts, well, let's hear their thoughts, right? So you do have in this period a burgeoning effort to
include women,
broaden the scope of who gets to be involved in the conversation.
So
just the nobility who have access to education, but a broader and broader spectrum of people.
So we actually did a full chapter in about an hour and a half, it looks like.
I think we could probably go faster, but
no, it's just that I'm going to go ahead and stop the thing here, unless we want to. Well, I guess let's just point out that next time will be chapter 2.
And it's Entro Evo Info, and we'll find out
which
what
is
that acronym is.
entropy, evolution, and information.
Information. Yep.
Yeah.
And counter enlightenments after that.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to this next one. I've already looked into it. Looks pretty good.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks for
I'm gonna go ahead
joining
and
the